Welcome everyone to Wednesday night's xLights Zoom room. We're going to talk a little bit today about the FPP 6.0 release announcement that occurred yesterday. A little bit about what the differences are. I've got a couple of instances up and running that we'll kind of walk through an upgrade process on one and talk about some of the new features and new things you may want to be interested in as we go through and talk about the release. Obviously, anyone who's in the room, welcome to raise their hand or holler or somehow just shout out if you have any questions along the way. I will do my best to answer them.
What we got going on?
This is very impromptu, so we're going to do our best to get our way through it. Was there a question I heard in there? Was that Mark or somebody? I didn't see that. Cool. So with the release, so all those who already run FPP may be already familiar that on GitHub, that's the repository for where the software is stored. GitHub FPP should bring you to this link here, GitHub/FalconChristmas/FPP. You may actually be on the initial log page for the project. Over here on the right-hand side, you'll see various releases in the past. If you just click any of these links, you should take you to the actual release page. Talk a little bit about some of the enhancements and walk through some of these items, and then we'll get into demonstration as well. At the bottom of these pages, for those who don't know, if you want to skip ahead, down towards the bottom will be a list of assets. The assets will be the files that you will need to download in order to install and get FPP up and running for those who would like to skip ahead. No chapter marks will be available in this recording. But one of the big differences in going from FPP 5.x to 6.0 is a complete upgrade of the underlying operating system. FPP runs on Debian. The older versions were a Debian Buster, which is Debian 10. something. FPP 6 now brings us Debian Bullseye 11. something, a complete new Linux operating system under the covers. And with that, there's a lot of networking changes and other changes that had to occur for this development in order for everything to operate as we expect. In FPP 6, a few things you may notice when we get ready to upgrade, we'll point it out. There's some security work that's been done. Previously, in previous versions of FPP, you might get like the initial setup page that comes up that allows you to set some basic parameters. That you could skip past that setup page if you like in the past, or just walk through it and finish. You will not be able to skip past it with FPP 6, and that's due to various laws around IoT devices and security nature of those devices. So on first boot up on FPP 6, it will now require you to choose either a UI password or not choose a UI password. And you can also choose to set a specific OS level password instead of accepting the default. Ideally, we recommend that you just choose the no UI password and the default, but just make sure you understand the security implications and that the choice has to be in the hand of the user, which is why it will now force you to make a choice before you can progress past that initial setup. Also in security updates, if you go into an advanced UI level, for those that are really advanced, you can now upload SSH public keys, and you can access the underlying operating system by way of using SSH public keys instead of username and password. One key thing specifically for common users is some services will by default be disabled. So Samba service, the rsync service, and the FTP services will now be disabled by default. If you require these services, you have to go in and explicitly enable them, and you need to be in the advanced UI level in order to enable those services. Samba, you may not recognize, but that's the one that allows you to use Windows Explorer to explore and browse to your FPP instance by just open up Windows Explorer, going // IP address, of your FPP. It'll bring up an FPP share, and you can actually access content through Windows Explorer. That will be disabled by default in FPP 6. If you need that functionality, you just have to explicitly go back in and turn it on. And that is a security decision because that share is created with no user authentication. So therefore that's available if somebody is on your home network already. It's available with no security, no user authentication. So the decision was made to have that disabled by default. You have to explicitly enable it if you want that function. You've seen a good handful of users coming in and out of the Zoom room that do use that feature. So that'd be something we might be alert to. That won't automatically be there on future releases. A lot of work's been gone into cape and hat selection. So a lot of the capes and hats, which would be a controller functionality that go on top of an FPP computer like a Raspberry Pi or a BeagleBone, a lot of those already have a physical EEPROM stored on the cape and hat, so it will detect those physical EEPROMs. So just as an example, we'll refer to CULP controllers. If you buy a CULP controller, it has a physical EEPROM, automatically identifies what type of controller it is, whether it's a K8, a K16, a K32, etc. The cape and hat selection will now, so it pulls from a physical EEPROM. If you have a controller cape or hat that does not have a physical EEPROM to self-identify, you do have to install what's called a virtual EEPROM. So it's using that same technology. It'll just be a virtual EEPROM for others, which also allows cape vendors who produce other capes to embed their logos, their images, their websites, their contact information can be stored in a virtual EEPROM, which could be installed and have that same kind of look feel as you would a cape with the physical EEPROM. Any immediate questions? I know I didn't stop at the security section. Any immediate questions on security or cape and hat selections and the idea about an EEPROM that contains cape information, like how many string ports, what it's capable of, and the virtual EEPROMs for standard capes. Example, Pi hats did not have an EEPROM before, but they will have to have a virtual EEPROM installed in 6.
If someone sets a UI password, is that going to affect their FPP Connect?
So when you define a UI password and then go into FPP Connect, it will, upon discovery, it will prompt you for that password.
Okay.
It likely today, as of earlier today, it likely will prompt you multiple times for that password on that one instance. There is an option to save that password when you go to FPP Connect and it prompts for that password. We can certainly walk through that here shortly when we get to the demo section and kind of showcase how that looks. Once you save the password, it will not prompt you again unless the password changes. Any other immediate questions on security items or KPAD or anything we've talked about so far? We'll move on through some of the announcements here. So for audio, so sound produced directly by the FPP sound code now is configurable so to support multi-channel sound instead of just stereo. And it does require a USB sound device that supports multi-channel output. So example, if you had a sound device that supported 7.1 and you had an audio file that had, that was encoded to 7.1, it would support that multi-channel, not just stereo. As of this point in time of this recording on, what is this, Wednesday, July 27th, xLights currently does not support multi-channel audio. However, if you had like 2 versions of the same file, you can manually upload that multi-channel audio if you need to, is how I understand it. I know that question came up in one of the chats earlier, and I don't do multi-channel audio, but that's what I heard about it. So there are some people I know have been looking for that particular feature. So networking changes. So since they changed to the new operating system, Debian Bullseye, the newer version of Debian, that brings some other potential networking options. There's some advanced options here specifically. Now FPP can function as a DHCP server, which will allow it to provide IP addresses automatically to other devices and has that function of including reserved DHCP leases. So this would be a more of an advanced configuration if you're operating a separate show network. Then that separate show network, the devices you attach, such as your Falcon controllers, your Hinks picks, your other controllers, a lot of times they come defaults configured as DHCP. So you can just plug them into your show network. They can automatically get an IP address on your show network IP address range provided by your FPP system that's providing the bridge service for that show network. I will caution everyone about using DHCP server. It is a great feature, but if you, after configuring it, you plug that interface into your home network, you could then have an additional DHCP server handing out addresses which are not for your home network. So just be aware that if you do decide to use this DHCP server, just don't plug that interface into another network other than your show network. Just be mindful about that. Be cautious. Another advanced networking option is the configuration of IP masquerading in NAT. So if you have that separate show network design, typically those devices on that show network may not have direct internet access. So you might not be able to do updates, might not be able to get time sync, etc. Just by the nature of that is a separate show network. You can configure your FPP device that bridges the networks as an IP masquerade in that, which would allow those show devices to be able to access the internet for time sync and be able to do updates and stuff directly. It will actually NAT or network address translation through that FPP device that bridges the networks. And another configurable advanced option would be to define a route metric. This will be even a more edge case. If you had a default gateway defined on multiple interfaces, which is absolutely not typical, but if you had a configuration where you needed to have a gateway address defined on multiple interfaces, this would allow you to configure a primary interface that you would want to use with a lower cost or a lower metric, and configure the secondary interface as a higher metric to make sure you don't end up in a unaccessible configuration. So that would be a very edge case scenario that you might want to use that. Typically, we're going to recommend that this is set to the default, which is set at 0. We'll see that in a moment briefly when we get into that. Questions about any of these advanced networking features that are now available in FPP6? Silence is golden. Either everybody's left already or everyone's just being quiet. So display testing, being able to test from FPP. This has been extended into an FPP command. So you can do an FPP command to start testing and to stop testing. You don't necessarily have to go to the status control display testing page anymore. You can actually do that as an FPP command, which allows a little bit easier API-based testing or other testing scenarios that you can do programmatically, as opposed to having to go to the display testing page to be able to do display testing. There are also certain output types right now just for LED panels or any BBB string output type that have a test pattern button located on them. For LED panels, let's say you have like a 2x2 LED panel layout or a 5x4 LED panel layout, whatever size, you can do test pattern and it will display a particular pattern on your panels if they're configured properly. And they'll also identify which output and which panel number. So example, your panel in the top left from the front typically would be configured as output 1, panel 1. The one to the left of it would be output 1, panel 2. The one to the left of that would be output 1, panel 3. Your second row would be output 2, etc. So it's another way to identify if you have your panels properly configured. If you recognize the test pattern, if it's misconfigured, the pattern would be unreadable. So it gives us another great advantage to be able to say, are my panels configured in a manner that would work properly with that panel type? If the test pattern shows the proper test pattern, and I do have an image of that I can show later for sure, then likely you have your configurations proper. For BBB string outputs for like your BeagleBone based controllers, such as the Culp controllers, the Scott Hansen design controllers, the Kurt controllers, etc. I know Wally's is now also offering a BeagleBone based controller based upon the Scott Hansen design. For those output types, there's a test pattern, which basically starts an RGB cycle, but the first pixels will be lit white in the quantity count of the port that they're on. Example, if it's port 1, you'll have 1 white pixel, the rest of them will be doing an RGB cycle. If you're on port 10, then the first 10 pixels will be white. The rest will be doing an RGB cycle. So it'd be a quick way of helping to identify, is this prop actually plugged into the port? I think it is. You can do that test pattern button and then count the number of white pixels, and it'll tell you the port number that they're physically plugged into. Kind of nice, kind of a bleed over type of test pattern like we see on that Falcon V4 series controllers. Yeah, the LED panels will output the panel number on each panel, and the BB strings will light up the first number of pixels white equal to the port number. Any immediate questions on display testing? So there's also more work in FPP6 on pixel overlay models and frame buffers. Frame buffer is the video frame buffer. Historically, that's primarily been used for things like virtual matrix. There are other output types and configurations could also use the frame buffer, but in earlier versions, it's kind of limited because you had to write directly to the frame buffer. We'll see some other notes down here below that we'll talk about relating to that. Historically, the pixel overlay models were primarily used for display testing, right? So I wanted to display test this, medium NSR tree number 1, or this candy cane number 2, or we want to display test by models, but those models can also be used in other aspects, and you can do overlays using the overlay models. Specifically, the models can now be also subdivided into smaller models, which can run just on part of a model. So you can take an overlay model like a matrix as an example, and you can subdivide that into a smaller matrix, and you can have effects on that smaller matrix, which is a subset of the bigger matrix model. I don't really do a lot of that, so I can't speak to great detail on all of the changes on the overlay models, but frame buffer devices are now configured as an overlay model as well. So example, virtual display, virtual matrix, some of those other output types now will write to a pixel overlay model, which is a frame buffer model. And then that model can be reused for other purposes, giving access to the frame buffer for other potential purposes. This allows like an HDR monitor to be, and you can do sub models and as well on the frame buffer model. So you can like divide an HDMI monitor can be divided into other areas that can display different content. So imagine potentially like a large matrix, virtual matrix projector on the house. You can project and you can divide it into subsections and have different content on those subsections, like the left side of the garage door versus the right side of the garage door, pretty easily without having to modify sequencing, right? You can do all that at the model level. Again, I don't know as great of detail about this particular changes and all, but obviously if anybody has questions, I'll do my best to note those down and get answers. One of the other big changes in FPP6 is some channel outputs for Raspberry Pis. There's a new output type called DPI Pixel Output. It's a new pixel driver for Raspberry Pis. It allows you to have a cape or be able to use 24 GPIO pins for 24 strings off of a Raspberry Pi. We've already seen some new controllers available in the market today, such as from Darren Headland of Micro CYB. Also the developer of the ESP Arch Sticks. He has a series of new Raspberry Pi hat type controllers, a 4-port controller, an 8-port controller, as well as a 16-port differential controller that now leverages this new DPI pixel output type. It's a new method to lay pixel data out on the GPIO. It allows to do 24 strings. Previously, we could only do 2 strings of 2811 output on a Raspberry Pi. There's also a new output type for twinkly channel output, so you can control twinkly lights. So your FPP can write output to twinkly lights and twinkly pro lights directly. It's a new output type in FPP6. And for LED panels config, there's a new auto layout button, which will make setup a little easier. So let's say I'm doing a 5x2 matrix panel out of P5 or P10 panels. Then there's an auto layout that will automatically configure outputs and panel numbers based upon your number of panels wide by number of panels wide, high. Instead of having to go through and click your mouse button a whole bunch of times to set those settings, auto layout will set the default wiring scheme for that panel size. Obviously, you can go in and tweak it if you're not using the default actual wiring size. Do see a question in here from Orlean about having an RPI 28D plus. If you upgrade to FPP6 without a license, will I be able to run more than 50 pixels per port? So that's a Pi hat from Hanson Electronics. The 28D has two 2811 ports on it and has a 2801 port on it out of the box. So if you use those ports as they are, you will not need a license at all to use that Pi hat the way that you've always been able to use it in previous versions, which means two standard outputs on the 2811 ports. And if you're using 2801 pixels, then you can use 2801 pixels on that port with no licensing needed. That comes into play if on that particular Pi hat. It's interesting. With the new DPI pixel outputs type, you could actually, with that hardware, you can actually drive 4 ports of 2811, utilizing the data line from the 2801 and for a third port, and using the clock line from the 2801 port as a 4th port. That would require the DPI pixel output type, and that would require a license, yes. So if you want to add additional functionality out of that RPI 28D plus, then you can select that in the channel output cape type selection to use DPI pixels as a 4-port DPI pixel, but that would require a license. If you leave the hat or cap type to the default type, it will work just the very same it did in 5.5. I see Mark also kind of answered that. Yes, but not using the DPI pixel output. Ryan also answered. Thanks, guys, for in the chat for watching that. Cool. The pixel string page, also in the channel output description, differences in FPP6, the pixel string page will now show warnings when channels overlap. So if you have channel overlaps on any of your ports, then the starting channel would be highlighted in yellow, and it'll be like, hey, by the way, you have a overlap here. So if for some reason you're manually configuring those output types, if you see yellow, then it'll give you a warning message that your channels overlap between multiple ports. Also on the pixel string page, if you highlight on the left side where it has the port number 1, 2, etc., when you hover over that, it will show you which GPIO pin that particular output uses. So in the standard Pi output type in the past, that would be GPIO 18 for port 1 and GPIO 19 for port 2. But in your new Pi hat types that use DPI pixels, those may be different depending upon your hat/cape manufacturer. They may choose to use different GPIO pins for different ports, and this will give you an easy way to see which pin is used for which port. Kind of a nice add, if you ask me. Any other questions besides what's already been answered about channel outputs and some of those changes? That's some kind of big changes in FPP6.
Yeah, yes. Can we go back up to the twinkly channel output?
Yep.
Great. So explain that in a little bit more detail. We'll be able to control the twinkly lights, but is it through the controller that comes with them, or would we be able to use one of our existing
It's
controllers?
a Ethernet output type. Let me get to one of my 6 instances here real quick. Pretty sure this one is Let me go to this one because this is on the release 6.0 release. So let me get rid of some of my Zoom windows here. Apologize. Input, output, setup, channel outputs. It will be an E131 ArtNet type output type. If I add an additional output here, make this H down here at the bottom, the output type can either output E131, ArtNet, DDP, or Twinkly. So it's a Twinkly takes its own protocol over the network. So you'd be able to configure a network output type to output Twinkly to whatever IP address that Twinkly system is on the network. I don't know, whatever. I don't have Twinkly and I don't
Sure.
know that much about Twinkly specifically. And then you'd be able to identify the number of channels needed. Right now, my understanding is there's a minor UI bug here that when I try to actually save this, it won't allow me to save total number of channels. So this would be, and one of the users I've seen post a comment, they had RGBW Twinkly. So they were 4-channel, 400 lights. So that would be a total of 1,600 channels.
Right.
And when I try to configure that and save, it wouldn't allow him to save it because it's a UI bug. So there will be a version 601 coming out shortly. There are a few other minor updates that have occurred since these images were created. So I do know Dan had indicated there's a 601 that will be coming pretty shortly. And this particular Twinkly, being able to define your number of channels would be resolved in that. The back end side works fine. It's just a user interface filter that doesn't allow this to work properly right now.
Okay.
But other than that, I don't know that much about Twinkly. So I guess the Twinkly device or controller can be on the network with an IP address, and you can send the Twinkly protocol to that device.
Right. Okay.
Times the number of, so for universe size, it doesn't actually use universes. Like universes is a E131/DMX concept. So it doesn't actually use universes. It would be the number of channels is what you would define for the number of lights that you have as what you would define for your universe size is how I understand that for Twinkly. Does that kind of answer your question right now?
Yes, thanks.
You're very welcome, very welcome. Back to the GitHub releases real quick. That was all about the new channel output stuff. Good question so far. There's been some adjustments to the scheduler as well. There's added ability to adjust the start and end times of future scheduled when extending a playlist runtime. And they added a button into the status UI so you can automatically start the next scheduled playlist. That's really pretty nice in the sense that if I'm on the status page here and I can preview my scheduling, these are all the schedules I have set right now for this instance. If I just start manually, it'll play forever until it's done, right? It won't follow the schedule, but I can start next and it'll automatically start the next scheduled end time and it will automatically stop at the next scheduled end time. So I can just say start next if I'm outside of my normal window and I want to start a little bit early, and it will still automatically stop according to the schedule. So that's a pretty nice feature add. I know that was a request. And they added a setting to display more than 2 weeks in advance of the schedule preview. So if you're in the schedule preview, historically only show you 2 weeks, but this can go out a little bit farther. There's an option somewhere. I don't remember exactly where that option is right now, where you can say show more of the upcoming preview schedules. Anyway. That's some schedule enhancements. Some major changes and some potential incompatibilities, obviously licensing, right? We've talked about that already. So some multi-string pixel capes will require a license, right? So that affects BeagleBones and Raspberry Pis. So there will be license key vouchers available for any existing controllers that you own that would require it. All you have to do is email. And right here, you can see shopfalconplayer.fax has a lot of information about the licensing for anyone who hasn't really read up about the licensing on that. I'm sure there may still be questions. Culp controllers, I know would not require a voucher or licensing processing. Any controllers that you build yourself, DIY controllers where you assemble the parts and you buy the kits or the pieces and you solder all of the pieces together and make your own controller hat. And those will always be available free vouchers for that. We want to, the development team is really wants to continue to encourage that DIY nature of the hobby. So if you build your own controller and solder it together, just send them a picture of it and in an email, and they'll be able to provide you a free voucher for licensing it to the full capabilities. I know Scott Hansen has some standard open source hardware plans out there where you can order a board and order the components and assemble them yourself. That's DIY. If you do buy from a vendor, a pre-manufactured Hansen type of cape, that's no longer a DIY, and that vendor will likely supply you with a voucher for licensing. So vendors have the option of providing you a voucher with the cape to get a licensing. And if that vendor does not supply you with a voucher, obviously it's really easy to go to shopfalconplayer.com and you can buy a license in there, like $10 for an 8-port, $15 for a 16-port, or $30 for a 48-port license. They are stackable. Obviously, there's a key announcement and facts, frequently asked questions out here on licensing for any other details. I know we could spend a whole hour on that probably if we need to. Yeah, and Padre just posted in chat the actual Shop Falcon Player site link, so it's easier to click directly right there in chat for anybody in the Zoom room right now. Another major change is for image playlist entry. So you could have a playlist entry to play an image instead of play a sequence, and that will now display on an overlay model instead of directly on the Linux frame buffer. So in the past, it just had to output it to the Linux frame buffer, so it'd be on like HDMI. But now you can display that image on an overlay model, which could be a frame buffer overlay model, or it could be like a standard pixel matrix or an LED panel overlay model. So now that image playlist entry to play an image via a playlist entry now outputs on an overlay model instead of on a frame buffer. So major change there. The virtual display has also been changed to writing to a frame buffer device, changed from writing directly to the frame buffer device to writing to a pixel overlay model. Again, trying to be able to extend that frame buffer utility to other future items. So they want to just modify, instead of directly writing to frame buffers, it writes to an overlay model, and that overlay model may be a frame buffer overlay model. Orlean asks in chat, if you build one yourself, do you have to prove that it actually works to get the free voucher? I don't believe you have to prove it actually works, but yeah, if you assemble a controller and it looks like a controller, acts like a controller, you believe it's going to work, send that picture in. I'm sure they're not going to show expect any kind of proof that it's actually functioning in order to get a free voucher, but that voucher will be tied to that cape, right? So anyway, virtual display, for those who don't use that output type, allows you to show kind of like what basically is your whole show. It's kind of like your whole house preview in xLights can display on an HDMI output type for the virtual display. So you can have like a TV set up to show you what's supposed to be playing on your lights, just like your whole house preview. There's also an HTTP virtual display option, which is not affected because that would display in a web page. So you can go to a web page and view your whole house preview, effectively what should be playing on your light, so you can kind of see what's going on without actually standing outside. It's an interesting output type. I don't see a lot of people use it, but it's a good output type. The virtual matrix, similarly, which is used quite a bit for either TVs or projectors and the such, it's also been converted to use a pixel overlay model. Any existing virtual matrix you have defined likely would need to be recreated after doing that, after upgrading to FPP6. That now, and we had that conversation just a moment ago. So with the FPP upload FPP Connect from xLights, and also when you upload from xLights for a virtual matrix, it'll auto create everything you need for a virtual matrix on your FPP. So if you have a virtual matrix set up on 5.5, you upgrade to 6, that virtual matrix may or may not work correctly, but I'd completely predict that if you go to xLights and re-upload from xLights, that should go ahead and deploy the new virtual matrix type, and it should work correctly. Obviously, if you have difficulties with that, there's plenty of resources available, including the Zoom room. We can help you get that taken care of. But they did modify the virtual matrix instead of going directly to the video frame buffer, and now talks to a pixel overlay model, and it will actually create the pixel overlay model for you automatically if one doesn't exist. There are also some old playlist entry types for doing volume up, volume down. There in the playlist, you can say turn volume up, turn volume down. Some other playlist entries for MQQ items, those were removed because they were really deprecated some time ago. They've been moved into FPP commands. So if you still want to do a volume, then you go to a playlist entry of FPP command and choose the FPP command to set volume up or down or whatever. Or similarly for MQTT, you go and add to your playlist an FPP command, and you can do the MQTT commands instead of having a specific playlist. So those were just removed and cleaning up some legacy stuff that they moved away from sometime back with the advent of 5.0. Any other questions besides what's been answered already on major changes and compatibility things we just kind of like quickly went over? I know it's kind of quick and this is kind of a high level overview, but now we'll move forward on to other updates, changes. So crash reporting. So you now have the ability, hopefully you'll never experience this, but similar to xLights, you know, when xLights crashes and it saves a crash report, you have that option to auto forward that crash report off into the xLights repository for the developers to look at that crash report and have details, and it helps them to identify potential crashes and stuff. Same kind of concept in FPP 6. Now it has the ability to do crash reporting. It will store those crash reports on your SD card in your file manager, as well as if you configure it to do so, and that's an option on that initial setup page we talked about, that it can also send those crash reports automatically to a internet repository for the developers to have access to those crash reports to help make sure they're always looking at any potential bugs or get bug analysis, get advanced detail about any kind of crashes to hopefully help correct them and introduce updates that correct them. Yeah, so that's kind of a nice little new update and changes. And I'm assuming a good number of people in this room are already pretty familiar with how to upgrade FPP, but the instructions are here. Basically, there's two options for upgrading, right? So there's a re-image where you pull the SD card out. You can do a backup of your configuration initially, right? Re-image your card with a fresh image and then restore the configuration, right? That's a traditional complete re-image of the SD card upgrade path. But also there's an in-place upgrade path that allows you to use the FPP OS update files to do an in-place upgrade. I will point out that if you want to do an FPP OS upgrade, and we'll demo that here shortly, we'll let that run while we do talk about other things, and then we'll come back and check on it. We won't stand around and wait on it. Make sure you're on the most current version of 5.5 first, right? On previous major releases, that wasn't always a requirement, but there are some specific things in 5.5 that need to be corrected before you can have a clean upgrade using the FPP OS file. So the process would be recommended to do an upgrade of FPP 5.5 first to the most recent, then do the FPP OS upgrade using the FPP OS image file, and that will maintain all of your configuration and everything and will not override any configuration. Paul T mentions in chat, although I haven't seen a failure on an FPP OS upgrades and I've done a bunch, I would suggest an FPP backup first. Correct. So back up your configuration first. There's two backup types. You can back up just the configuration, or you can do a complete file-based backup to a USB drive that's plugged into your FPP. But at least make sure and do a backup of your configuration. Let's say for an example, somebody already did an FPP OS upgrade and they did not upgrade to 5.5 first, then that upgrade may be incomplete and FPPD may or may not run. But if you just do the FPP OS update a second time, it will go ahead and complete successfully and you will be fine. If you're already on the 6.x version, so the 6.x versions has been out to date, have been the beta versions that you've been able to update on the master. I would still recommend doing a FPP OS update or a reimage. If you're current on the existing deployment you have of the 6.x beta, you should not need to do anything other than the FPP OS update. There are some OS changes in the release, the production release, as opposed to the beta release. David asks, is there anything that needs to be changed in xLights if you upgrade to 6? Nothing specifically that comes to mind other than the cape types and the variants. So in xLights, we're just going to flip over here real quick and identify that. Let me go back to my earlier lab folder where I've got many devices here. Let me go back and set this as an FPP type and pi hat type. So there are some new variants that can be available. So if you have a standard pi hat, this 2 output RPi 2811X, if you're going to continue to use them as you always have with the standard output type, then you just need to make sure you have the proper variant defined. Obviously, if you're using 2 output DPI pixels, which will allow you to re-enable the onboard sound if you so choose, which would require a license. Or if you do the 24 output, generic 24 output type, then it would, this is one thing that's different. You just have to define your proper variant depending on how you're driving it. If it's just an FPP player, there's nothing different. It will still be discovering an FPP Connect just like 5.5 and nothing new in there. Like just if you're using FPP controllers, specifically some of the Pi controllers, you may have different vendors like this micro CYB that I have here today. Excuse me, picked the wrong one. And some of his new 4-port, 8-port, and 16-port controller hats. So that would be the only thing I know of in xLights that you would need to change on FPP6. Just if you have those newer controller types, you would need to, specify, right? Hopefully that answers David's question there too. It looks like all the questions I see in chat right now. So 2 upgrade types, selecting the image, y'all can go through and read that. The images available, obviously they're different for BeagleBone based or Pi based. So obviously there's the FPP6 BeagleBone image zip. That's the full image for if you're going to write that onto an SD card using that first upgrade type for a BeagleBone based controller or for a Raspberry Pi based. And then of course the FPP OS files for BeagleBone, for the FPP OS files for Pi that would allow you to do that in place upgrade that we just spoke about. Any other immediate questions? Anybody's welcome to come off from mute. Chat looks quiet right now.
Ron, any changes to how audio output has to be configured on a cape or how it's plugged in? In other words, if somebody's running audio and it's working fine now, are there any expectations they'd have to change how their cape is hooked up?
No, they shouldn't need to, right? So historically, especially if you're trying to output audio from a Pi, which had a pixel output type defined on the GPIOs, like through a cap, then that would disable the onboard audio. And we recommend using a sound blaster. The sound blaster is always going to produce better audio quality than the onboard audio will. So you continue to use the sound blaster just fine. You configure to use it just like you did before. Nothing really different there that I'm aware of, right? And just saw in chat that Padre reshared the FPP releases link for that information. So there should not be anything necessary there. Let's say that you do have that configuration where you're trying to drive audio with a pixel hat on the Pi and you wanted to use the onboard audio, that would demand that you move to a DPI pixel output type, which would require a license. So basically you move the virtual EEPROM, and we'll look at that shortly. I don't think I've got one installed on here. Yeah, I do. I've got one installed on here. This is 6. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. But input output channel outputs, pi hat. This is a EEPROM. There's 2 CAPE configs. This is the standard one that we all know and love that would cause the onboard audio to be disabled. If I choose this DPI pixels output type, then that would allow the onboard audio to be re-enabled, but obviously would require this EEPROM to be signed, and it'll require a license key to sign it. So if I wanted to move away from an external sound adapter and move to the onboard sound, I could switch to DPI pixels. Nothing in xLights would need to change for that. That would just be a configuration within FPP. So hopefully it touches that subject enough to answer your question. But like if you're using the Culp K16 or such, my 16 hasn't been upgraded yet, so 5524. If you're using the K16 or such, it'd still be the standard
Right.
audio DaVinci audio type, and everything on like the Culp K16 and K32 would still be no different, whether it's 5.5 or 6.x.
Cool. Thanks.
You bet, you bet, you bet. So I'll go ahead and flip over into my demo lab environment. I got a handful of systems here. So as you've already seen, I've kind of flipped through a couple of instances that are already on 6.0. I'm going to close this one because that's still on master branch because I was testing some other updates. And then I've got one that's still just 5.5. So we're going to start on the 5.5 device. If you click the version number up here in the corner, that takes you to the about page. Also, you can go to help about right here. And this is where you're going to do your upgrades from. What is the Zoom room password? Okay, David has got that in there, and Ryan answered. So cool. You notice that this is just the base level 5.5, no updates. It shows that there is an update available. And I have already previously downloaded FPP OS files for 5.5 and 6.0 that we're going to use in a minute. So whatever version you're on, it would be recommended to go ahead and upgrade initially to the latest of your existing version. So we'll go ahead, should be pretty quick. We'll let this go as I talk through that. So this will actually go through and upgrade to the latest version of 5.5. It won't get you to 6 just by doing this update. So we're going to let this run through a little bit. I'll go ahead and switch over to the 6, and we'll kind of start talking about a few of the new things that I'm going to bring this releases out in another tab so I can alt tab back and forth a little easier. Bullseye, security, advanced level. Like to enable the Samba, this is one thing I think some of our users, and I know a couple of users in this room right now, absolutely use this feature. So Samba, which is the Windows file sharing. So I want to just double check my FPP settings, the UI. And I'm currently in advanced. I want to set that to basic right now, right? And go back to status control. I'm assuming that this is actually disabled right now. So let me just bring up a Windows Explorer, and I should basically be able to say, I got all my machines named and I can access them by name, but //PyCap. If I enter that in this browser, it's going to sit here and think a little bit, and it'll come back and say, hey, I can't access it. What are you talking about? There's nothing to access. Right. So this fails. That used to work in previous versions. That would show you the content of your FPP, and you can upload, download, access log files, and etc. So I'm just going to minimize that for a little bit. So I'm going to go back to FPP settings and system. And there's some system settings in here by default, but you notice there's, I can set my OS password. This is new. I can use the default password or set a custom operating system password. My recommendation is to leave that on default. Obviously, if you're security conscious and you want to change that password from the default that everybody knows, you can choose custom, and then you can specify a password to choose. And I can enable rsync, but I don't have any of these others. So if you don't see those settings under FPP settings system, you have to set your user interface level to advanced. This is an advanced level setting. Then go back to system. And you'll see some new options in here with these little blue hats. These little blue hats indicate these settings are only available in advanced level. And if I scroll on down here, this is where we talked about you can upload an SSH key for anybody who really needs to do root or FPP users and upload SSH keys for authentication. Highly advanced topic. If you understood that, you know how to do it. If you don't understand it, don't worry about it. So here is this enable Samba SIFs. So it's disabled by default. If I just enable that, it should little spin here and come back and say that's now enabled. And this is actually a live test. I have not re-enabled this yet. So you get a little notification up in the corner saying it's now enabled. And if I go back here and say //PyCap is the name of the system, it should come up with my FPP share, and I can see my FPP contents and access my any backups I may have had. I can access my music folder. If I had any music on here, I know there's sequences, right? So I got sequences on this instance, just a couple of quick ones, right? Of course, the obligatory all butterfly for all my models, right? And so this is one way of accessing your FPP device that will be disabled by default now. That's how you can kind of go through and enable it. Advanced UI, enable Samba SIFs, and then back to it operating the way that it was before. Let's talk about cape hats and EPROMs and such. So I'm going to flip back to that earlier version and see if it's completed with my 5.5 upgrade, and it says it has. So I'm going to close. Notice the version now shows 5.5-24. This is now the most recent version of 5.5. So everything, nothing new here. This is 5.5. You're all known. I chose to previously download that FPP OS file. Oops, it's in uploads. And download this directly manually. You don't have to pre-download it. You can go right back to that help about page. This upgrade OS option would show FPP 6 and then download just like the beta. And then it will go through the download process and then go through the upgrade process. Just to save time, I previously downloaded that so that we can just do the upgrade directly without having to go through the waiting on the download, right? So I'm going to go ahead and initialize this upgrade OS. This is how you would upgrade from 5 to 6. Make sure you're on 5.5, the most recent version with the green upgrade button first. Then do the FPP OS 6 upgrade, then upgrade OS. Boom. It's going to say this is likely going to take a long time. Make sure you're running FPP backup first. This will preserve all your settings, although it is a smart idea to do a configuration backup before you make any changes, right? So this will run for a little bit. So while this is running, we're going to go back to our other instance that we were just talking about a minute ago. And we were kind of on this cape hat selection period, right? So channel outputs, I'm going to show you, let me just do this real quick. And so you'll see what the default would look like. And I want to tell this guy to reboot since I just removed that EEPROM. So if you were doing a fresh, brand new 6, not an in-place upgrade, but a fresh, brand new 6, there will be nothing under pixel strings. If you go to channel output pixel strings, it will be blank. This should come up here in about 2 more ping packets here real quick. I'm just kind of using this as a monitor to watch this guy go through a reboot. And as soon as he comes back up, I know I can continue. Obviously your standard output types. This is cached in the browser right now because that guy's not actually up yet. So I got my network output types in pixel strings. He's up and running. Let me refresh this page, make sure he refreshes. Yep, he's up and running. Cool. So fresh out of the box, this obviously is going to be all empty. And the pixel strings is going to be completely empty. And you'll be like, hey, what's up? I should be able to put a hat on this and use it, but this will be blank because you're going to have to install a virtual EEPROM to use any pixel output on a Raspberry Pi system out of the box, right? So you're going to install virtual EEPROM. Then you have a choice of standard virtual EEPROMs. This list may grow down the road. Right now we have a standard Pi hat. You have the RPi 28D type EEPROM, like we had discussed earlier. The RPi MFC, which is a multifunction cap from Hanson Electronics as well. And the SPI pixels, which I just haven't seen anybody use in the last couple of years anyway. That's for different pixel types, not 2811 pixel types. So we're going to choose to install on this Raspberry Pi a standard Pi hat virtual EEPROM. Install. It kind of goes through, hey, this is all there. Please reboot. It's going to prompt us to reboot. I'm going to move forward with a few things here before I reboot, just kind of in essence of time. I know we're going kind of probably a little bit long, about an hour in so far. So hopefully everybody's okay. Pi hat, you have two config types we showed earlier. The standard Pi hat, which would not require any licensing. There's no banner here. I can set my pixel count to 126. I can hit save and it saved my pixel count, everything fine, right? So I can use a standard Pi hat in the standard manner we've always had before with no extra licensing, right? Obviously, you can observe I have these two ports. So this first port, I configured 126 pixels, which takes me from one channel to 378 channel. And the second port starts at 151. These now turn yellow. You can see, oh, I have these channels for output 1 and 2 overlap. This is just a demonstration of how these channel overlaps will be able to be highlighted. If you accidentally configure something with an overlap, it'll be right in front of your face that it's an overlap, right? I can say, oh, I really want this to start at 379 and I no longer have an overlap. Now, typically you won't be manually configuring this. You're going to do that from xLights and using the xLights upload and all those features and not manually configuring any of these pixel counts or channels types anyway. But just if you did and you had an overlap, if this is yellow, you can see that right away that I've got an overlap between these channels. LED pattern. I do not have LED panels attached to this one, but I could output a test pattern really quick and easy. Right here is where it's going to start the pattern. You should see that outputting if I had something configured and then stop outputting. And then to demonstrate the auto layout option, if I said I want to configure a 5 wide by 4 high, you can see all of these down here are configured as output 1, panel 1, output 1, panel 1. So historically, you had to go through and change all these. If I just say auto layout, this will reconfigure all of your output and panel numbers with one output per row and all panels facing in an upwards direction. Are you sure? Say yes. Boom. My standard layout is now output 1, panel 2, panel 3, panel 4, panel 5, output 2, panel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, output 3. So that just saved me 36 mouse clicks or however remaining, right? So this auto layout is a nice feature that we just demonstrated as well, right? Obviously, this is if you're viewing the config from the front, you can still turn that off and view it from the rear. That say that you do have a panel that for for whatever reason, this one is upside down. You can still manually change these. It's just the auto layout sets the default settings, or that's the standard settings. If you had non-standard settings, you can still come in here and adjust that and save it, and you'll be off to the races with your panel layout. So that's a nice little panel layout discussion. I'm going to check in on this FPP OS update, and this guy is still cooking on this other device, so we'll come back to him shortly. Any questions on the idea of virtual EEPROMs? This will only be needed for Pi hats or BeagleBone based controllers that do not have a hardware EEPROM on them. If there is a hardware EEPROM, like my K8B, which is also on an older version of Master right now, and I go to channel outputs, it will automatically recognize that. You won't have an option for install virtual EEPROM because there's a physical EEPROM on that, which helps define what outputs and stuff are available for that particular controller type. So it'll automatically recognize that based upon the hardware EEPROM. So the virtual EEPROM option is only available if you have a Pi Hat or a BeagleBone Cape type controller that does not contain a hardware EEPROM. Went through kind of a lot of demonstrations, audio networking. We won't talk a lot about that tonight unless people have specific questions. Display testing, right? So that's a good one. So PiCap. I'm gonna go ahead and tell this guy to reboot because I reinstalled that virtual EEPROM. Oh, I apologize. I want to back up. Virtual EEPROM. There's more things I want to discuss on virtual EEPROM. Again, I'm pinging this controller, so we'll wait for him to reboot and we'll go in and talk about the EEPROM signing. I guess I can start with the COLP. So with FPP6 and the help about page, I'm going to back up a little bit. In previous versions, if you go to help about, and if your controller had a hardware EEPROM, it would show up down here in the CAPE information section. It would show you information about that. Actually, I still have a 5 on my K16, so we can demonstrate that. Go to the help about. Down here at the bottom, it shows you about my Cape Hat. It tells me what it is, what version it is, its serial number. Kind of this is a xLights based controller. And so it would show you this data right here on this help about page in FPP5, right? Now in FPP6, they just took it to a new page called Cape Info page. So it's not available right here, but here at the bottom of this page, you can go right to the Cape Info page. You could also go to help and then Cape Info and come right to that same page. So you get the same basic information here. You can see that it's unlimited licenses. It's signed with the DK key. That's the key type that it's signed with for unlimited outputs using the BBB string controllers. So you can see real easily that it's already signed. Obviously, you get vendor information and the logos. If I go to the EEPROM signature page, you can see that this EEPROM is currently signed with that and using that output driver. So this Cape is licensed for full set outputs. Nothing to do with an EEPROM signature. Don't have to worry about it. If for some reason something happens to that physical EEPROM, or like this is a version 1.0 and Dan would come out with a little bit of a change and you have a version 1.1, you can go to the EEPROM upgrade page. You could select any available downloads. There are no downloads available for the K8. If there one's available, you would be able to choose through this download, pick the version 1.1, and then do an upgrade and upgrade the contents of that physical EEPROM if there was ever an upgrade necessary, right? We were helping a user with that earlier today. So that's a little bit about what the Cape Info page will look like on a COLP-based controller that's already signed for unlimited use, right? Already signed, nothing to do here, right? It is pinging. Why is this guy not liking me? Just wasn't liking me there for a minute. So if I go back to that same help Cape Info page on my Pi, it shows me that I configured it as a Pi Hat. The serial number, because I'm using a virtual EEPROM, is just, there's no actual serial number. So I just called it FPP internal. And talks a little bit about this Cape type and the signature, but the signature is not using any output drivers which would require it. So there's no signing needed, no keys needed, no licensing needed for using the standard Pi Hat to output Pi Hat type, right? Which is defined from the channel outputs, this selection right here. If I choose the DPI pixel type, obviously it's going to warn me that it's not signed. The output will be limited to 50 and smart receiver port is disabled unless I go sign it, which I need a license key to sign it, right? Also note that once I change that, once I exceeded the allowable pixel count, you can see that this pixel count is now in red because this Cape currently is only licensed by this selection, only licensed to use 50 pixels because it's currently unlicensed. You also get this link right here to jump to the Cape Info page. When I do that and go to the signature, I got to reboot first after changing that type. So let me go back to input output channel type, hi-hat, make sure it's on DPI pixels and save. Oh, it won't let me save as long as this is in red, right? So I can have a maximum of 50 and then save for that type. And when you change this type, it says restart FPPD, but as you'll observe, when I hit restart FPPD, it will actually go through and do a reboot, and you'll notice that because it'll stop responding here pretty shortly. And then it'll stop responding for 30 or 40 seconds until it reboots. So even though it says restart, it's actually doing a reboot when you change the cape config type. All right, so now I'm back to my earlier system that we are upgrading from 5.5. And I noticed that the FPP OS upgrade is complete. And it went through its reboot cycle. It said it's rebooting, close this window and refresh. It may still be in the process of rebooting. We'll double check that shortly. And I know I bounce around a lot, but just trying to save some time. That guy is currently not. I know that it's that's the right IP actually for him. We'll give him a moment, otherwise we will do a hard reboot. Oh, that one's powered through the cape. It's not doing PoE, so I can't. I'll have to get up and power cycle him probably. We'll wait a little bit, see if he comes back, or we'll power cycle him. But this other guy that already was 6, I saved and rebooted, I refreshed, and he's back. This is the guy that already is 6 we were just working on. I came in late. Where did I go to see the recording? The recording's not posted yet. We'll probably post it. I'm not sure if we really identified it yet. Daryl and team, do you think it'd be appropriate to probably post it in the official xLights group on Facebook? Probably.
Yep, that makes sense.
I'm fine with that. That's where some of the other recordings were previously saved. Hopefully this is going well for everybody. But now that we're on DPI pixels, let's run to that cape info. And you'll notice that now that the output driver lists it as DPI pixels, and it shows that there are no licensed outputs. EEPROM is not signed. Get an option here to do an EEPROM signature. Once I have my license key, I will have an order number also. So I would complete my order number here, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. I don't have this license key right now. Put in the license key. You'll get an email once you get your license, and I'll put in your order number and your license key, sign EEPROM, and it'll automatically go through and sign. And it's just saying it's not there is. I'm going to reboot this guy one more time. Because where this says offline signing, if your controller, your Pi-based controller, BeagleBone-based controller that requires signing is not reachable on the internet, then it would show offline signing and give you the ability to do basic order number, license key, download a packet. Then you'd go to their shop forum offline signing page. You would upload that packet, and then you'll get a signed packet back. You would choose that file and upload the signed packet. So there is a method in place to be able to do offline signing for those controllers that are not internet connected. Just know that you would have to then do this, download this packet, take that file, go to machine that is internet connected, log into your account on Shop Falcon Player to upload the signing packet, and then you'll get back an above link that you'll download a new file. Then you just choose file to find that file browser for that file you download, and then you'd be able to sign it. Evidently, the time that rebooted, it didn't think it was on the internet, which is fine. All of this information, by the way, is going to be in the FPP6 manual. So Rick Harris, which is a valued community member, usually keeps that manual up to date. And I know he's been working really hard over the last several months to kind of get that manual up to date. Some of these screenshots are a little bit different on the release than they were for the beta releases. So I know he was capturing some of the newer screenshots, starting yesterday and this morning. And that FPP 6 manual should be out in pretty short order. And all of these processes will be documented quite well in that FPP manual. If you're unfamiliar, if you go to help and then FPP manual, that will take you to the manual automatically. Right now, this is just a one-page placeholder for the FPP 6 manual. Once that is published, then that help FPP manual will take you straight to it. Right now, you can click this link and go to the 5.5 manual, which won't have the 6 specific items in it, right? So help FPP manual is the quick and easy way to get directly to the FPP manual, and that will be updated with all the 6 content in pretty short order, I would say. Let me try to ping this other controller, see if he is actually any questions or anything we talked about so far. I'm going to walk over here and manually reboot that guy because after his update, evidently he may have a different IP address. Actually, I know he will have a different IP address and it may not have registered with my dynamic DNS server yet. So that's hard reboot him and I'll have him back up and running here very shortly.
Would there be any interesting ways of determining all the different vendors now that make controllers for FPP?
I imagine there will be more that come, right?
Is
And
it sort of hidden in FPP right now, or in xLights even, I guess, maybe? I don't know.
no, I would think in xLights, right? So the vendor, the controller vendors, this list grows as more controllers become known. This is kind of an after the fact, right? Because somebody kind of has to produce a product and then it's like, oh yeah, well, it's now included in the auto upload and included in the vendor selection in xLights. I don't know that there's going to be a central list. That might be, I know that you help maintain and there's several like sequence vendor lists. So I don't know if it would be warranted, like, hey, here's a list of Cape vendors. I don't know, but
Well, one would think they'd all checked in with Dan, I would think at some point, but no guarantees, I suppose.
I know that the development team has reached out for people that were building capes and they kind of have some sort of a list that they were communicating with those vendors that they knew were going to be producing capes or already have been producing capes. And they've been working with those vendors on the 6 developments. People like the Darren Headland, the Jeremy, there's probably a few others. I don't know what that list is.
With
and
the
I don't know if that's public, I don't know if that would be a public facing list. I don't know that answer.
would David Pieces fall under this here, the Genius controllers? Would that be in there, or would it be still to come?
So that is not an FPP.
It's not
based
FPP
controller.
based. Oh, okay, yeah.
Right. So I would presume once those are available that there would be a vendor selection here for experienced lights. And then
They're
you would
not
pick
FPP
the
based, okay.
experience, but they're not FPP based, so they're
right.
not relevant to the FPP discussion specifically, right? Test Pi 3 is back up and running. I can see that here. So this is the one we did the in-place upgrade on. So in-place upgrade, he's running FPP 6. Notice the OS build number changes a little bit. There's always been a little confusion, like I'm on FPP 5, but my OS says 5.3, or my FPP is 5.5 and my OS is 5.3. I try to upgrade OS, but it's still 5.3. We get that kind of comment. Ultimately, the OS 5.3 was the most recent 5. Version of the OS, right? So the OS and FPP are packaged and delivered together, but they are separate entities. So they did change the OS build versioning number so that there wouldn't be any confusion between the FPP would be the software version, and then the OS build would be the basis of the Debian OS and its packages and its configuration of the operating system. So in beta, this was V 2022-05, and the release is V 2022-07. So there is the different versioning number for the operating system build, but yet if I want to upgrade OS, it's still going to be based upon the FPP version because this is bundled together, FPP and OS bundled together, but you select it based upon the FPP version, and it will come with the default OS for that specific version. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully I described that kind of well. Back to the release notes here. Certain outputs, we talked about the display testing is where we were kind of left off there, right? When I had to reboot this guy. So this test Pi 3 represent our in-place upgrade, how easy that was. If I go to channel outputs, this guy did not have a cape installed. So this also is the blank. I would, if I had a Pi hat on here, I would install it. If I had a controller with a hardware cape, you notice this micro CYB logo up in the top corner. And if I go to channel outputs, he automatically knows this is an M16. This is one of Darren Headland's new capes that's just showed up for me yesterday. And that I ordered and added it to my fleet. So this is 16 port Raspberry Pi based cape. It has a hardware EEPROM on it. So it automatically detected that it was the M16. There is no option to install a virtual EEPROM. So in this case on the outputs, it looks very similar to what you would expect to see, similar to like a Colt controller with a hardware EEPROM. I recognize what type of controller cap it is. The tab shows it. I get my 16 ports available to configure. It currently is not signed. But if I go to the cape info tab, I can see all the specifics that this is a designer by Darren Headland. This is his vendor name and all that. This is an example of a new vendor that's producing capes and using the hardware EEPROMs to identify his capes. You can see that he is not currently licensed for outputs, why we were getting that warning message. But yet I could go to EEPROM signature, enter the license key and the order number and sign it. If I have a voucher instead of a license key, so example, right now, between now and July 31st, if you buy one of these multi-string capes, such as these micro CYBs, and you buy it before July 31st, send your proof of purchase, whatever that is. So whether that's an email, an order number, a picture of the controller, as long as it's dated before July 31st, and send that to the email shop at falconplayer.com. Then they will provide you a voucher free of charge to license its capes. So if I had that voucher number, I could put in that voucher number, put in my first name, last name, email, and password. If I do not already have an account, then one will automatically be created for me. And I'll take that voucher number, create an account with my email and password, and then it would create an order automatically and email me the order number and the license key. But if you did this through the redeem voucher process, it should take care of all of that process for you, automatically create the order, automatically get the key, automatically sign the EEPROM, boom, now you're assigned EEPROM and you're good to go. Again, this process will be documented in the FPP6 manual quite well, but it should be pretty straightforward. If I have a voucher, so if I buy a cape, even after July 31st, if I buy a cape from a manufacturer who supplies a voucher with the cape, then you'll get a voucher code, and then that voucher code and your email and all that. And this will be now associated with you as the end user, and it automatically you'll get it signed and be full output. EEPROM signature. If I did not get a voucher and I bought a cape that requires licensing, but I did not get a voucher, I can go directly to the shop falconplayer.com. I can sign in. I can place an order for, this is a 16 port cape. They get me a 16 port license for $15. And then once I complete that order, I'll be emailed an order number and a license key, and do order number, license key, sign EEPROM. So 2 methods to get that signed. Either I buy the license key directly from Falcon Player, or I get a voucher from a vendor and use the voucher process. Any quick questions on the signing and the voucher process and those items? I don't hear any questions, don't see anything popping up in chat. I'm gonna flip back to some of the changes on display testing, right? So FPP status control display testing. Enable, and I want to do a chase or a cycle. Anything configured on this should now be outputting. I see some pixels lighting up in my house right now. Anything that's configured for these channels should automatically be happening. I can also, if I choose to say, I want to multi-sync that out. So let's say I got remotes also, because normally display testing won't display test on FPP remotes. But they say, there's just, I didn't mean to move that over there, but 1, 2, 10,000 channels. And I did multi-sync. Now this display testing should be outputting on all my FPP remotes as well. I believe that this multi-sync check mark right here right now is one of the things that will be fully functional in 601. So that may or may not work right now in 6.0. That is a new feature. There was some minor tweaks that be made for that. So that's one new thing here on the standard testing page. Let's say I don't want to go to the standard testing page. So I'm just back in the status control wherever I can do an FPP command. There's an FPP command called test start. I can pick the test pattern I want to do. Let's say it's a RGB cycle, and I'm going to do RGB all. And what channel numbers or whatnot do I want to test? And this can be whatever channel numbers I want to pick and choose. By default, it's putting the channel numbers that this instance knows about, and say run now, and my test just started testing. Yep, I see that. Cool. And then I can do test stop. So it's just a new method. I apologize. My mouse there. I do test stop, run now, and my test just stopped. So these FPP commands are also available as an API. So you can programmatically start testing and stop testing. You know, when I do test start, if I had models defined in here, I could erase this field. This field auto filters. So I have models defined. So it had by default, it had just channel numbers in here. And then I don't see any of my models. So this is an auto filtering list. So you might have to delete out of that list and then reselect your down, and you can pick particular models. Like I'm picking my counter pixels that are my pixel, say run right now, and they're now doing an RGB chase. That strip across my kitchen counter is doing an RGB chase, and I would do a test stop to stop it. So just a new way to do testing without having to go to the test page. Any questions on that? I see a chat item up here real quick. David R saying good night. All good night, David. Hope I didn't miss you. I think we covered a lot of the key points. We kind of talked through a lot of the key points, licensing, image playlist, display, virtual upgrades. We did a live upgrade. Went through a whole bunch of stuff really quick. Are there any specific other questions or conversation on the subject that hasn't been already discussed or answered?
I have a question. I don't know whether you've said it or not.
Fire away.
If you buy a actual, like Culp or,
Mhm.
Falcon, do you have to worry about buying the license?
Okay, so Falcon controllers do not run FPP, so the licensing is only related to FPP. So that answer is no for Falcon controllers, absolutely. Culp controllers, I've got a couple of them here real quick. Let me just flip open to that real quick. My K8 is already on 6. So Culp controllers are pre-signed. So if I go down here to the Cape info, you can see any Culp controller licensed outputs will be unlimited, and they're already signed. So you'll say that this EEPROM is already signed. So if I buy a Culp controller, there's nothing you need to do with licensing or anything. They will work exactly as they always have worked.
Okay.
With questions. I do expect to see a Pi-based hat coming from Falcon that will be more than 2 ports. You know, they have the Falcon Pi cap that's been out for many years, which is 2 ports. If you have one of those and use it the same way on the same 2 ports, then there's no license needed for it at all. Regular Falcon controllers, F16, F48s, etc., don't run FPP, no such thing as licensing, don't worry about it. But there
Okay.
likely will be a new Falcon Pi cap coming out that will have more than 2 ports, and it would likely require licensing, yes. No, I believe that, I apologize, misspoke. It will come pre-signed is how I understand it, but those are not yet released, so once they release, we'll know for sure. But
Okay.
they be pre-signed just like the Colts.
All right, appreciate it.
You bet, you bet. Any other questions or conversation?
And Ron, maybe just to follow up
Yeah, Mark?
for some confusion that some people may have, if you're using FPP just as to run your show as a player, you're not going to need a
Correct.
license. You can use 6.0 without a license if you're just using it strictly as a player.
Absolutely. So FPP has lots of functionality, right? This is my player. So if it's just a player, no licensing whatsoever. The only things that require licensing are BBB string output type. So if you have a BBB Beagle Bone based hat and you go to channel outputs for BBB strings like the K8s, the Wallies will be probably identified as a Wally 16. We saw the micro CYB be identified as an M16-Pi. So if you're using the Beagle Bone type output type, or if you're using a Pi hat driving pixels directly using the DPI pixels type, that's the only thing that requires license. So if I'm just a straight player, no license. If I'm using it as a virtual matrix, no license. If I'm using it to output DMX to, like, say, some Lore controllers or some Renard controllers, no license. Any other output type, LED panels, no license. Any other output type that I can pick and choose through the list of available output types, no license. If I'm using it to output to other controllers, so if it's a player and outputting to my Falcons or my WLED controllers, or if I'm outputting to other controllers, no license. Only if it's directly controlling pixels and using on a Raspberry Pi using the new DPI pixel output type, or a Beagle Bone and it's non-cold. So hopefully that answers your question. As a player, no licensing. For a lot of functionality that FPP has, no licensing. That's all completely open source. So Wings, I just see commenting, new to the Zoom room, trying to figure out how to, and Daryl's answering you there. So down at the bottom, there's a reactions button. Then you should get a raise hand. So feel free to raise your hand and all that. We were just going over a quick demonstration of the new FPP6. I think we're about to wrap that up and stop recording unless there's any other questions. I'll still be hanging out if there are other questions, but anyone else that's familiar with FPP have any additional comment or anything I might have missed that might be relevant? Quiet group tonight. Yay.
Seems like a good time to wrap it up then. Ron, great presentation.
You're very welcome, everyone. Glad to be here. Glad to go through it impromptu like, and I'm going to go ahead and stop recording for now. And I'll still be hanging out for other questions and discussion. We'll answer Wings questions.